actually.
Thank you, everybody.
Hello.
So, no, sorry, you go.
This is how it always starts out.
Yeah, it's always trouble.
So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jason Austin, and this is Aleksandr Mergold. Should be like this.
No, actually, no.
No?
We're right.
Okay.
Okay, good. There's a plus right here.
So essentially, we are here to talk about a little bit of our practice and give you a glimpse into our work, our thinking, our backgrounds, which have strongly influenced our design work to date. So without further ado,
Yeah, so we're actually, I must say, we're really excited about the theme this year. We've obviously tried this competition a couple of times, and the previous themes were sort of, I don't know, just didn't do it for us. But when we heard about resource, we were really excited. Like this has our name on it finally, because we're actually working on a project called Grand Resource at the time. Like, well, all right, fine. And also, it kind of gave us an opportunity to sort of rethink our practice in this kind of way of resource, and we realized actually we were sort of reasonably sourceful or resourceful type. I mean, you'll see this thing reappearing constantly as this kind of a patch. At some point, it will probably become slightly annoying.
and sort of as part of thinking about this lecture and preparing forward, we thought, well, what is our biggest resource as a practice? And in general, I think I'd say that, you know, we have to reprocess our practice and thinking about, well, it is about the place and our backgrounds, and ultimately it's about where we grew up. So if we look at the A and plus the M here, this is actually similar to my home. Andy Wyatt painting Christina's Dreams.
Oh.
You have a pointer?
Yeah, that could be Jason right there,
That could
pretty
be.
much. That's not quite exactly where I'm from, but that's more or less the general area of the background. And why I like this image, this is 1925 tower in Moscow. It's actually a very kind of resourceful structure. It sort of achieves a lot with very little. You know, it's basically a few pieces of steel that they bolted together in 1925, I believe, and there it went. And actually, I think it was supposed to be at least a third taller, but they ran out of steel. So
also a little comparison here of scale. The A is actually kind of supposedly close to my house. I don't think it's quite at my house, but you'll notice the landscape of my hometown versus.
Yeah, well, there was landscape in there, not a lot, but sort of highly densely urban sort of deal versus that. This, for those of you in the know, this is the ceiling of the Green Dragon Cafe at Cornell University. It's sort of symbolic on many levels for us. Well, first of all, you'll see why later once you maybe see the exhibition and once you see some of the later projects, the cans. But it also, this is where what we have in common, first of all, because we both went to undergrad there, we're actually in the same class, and you know, we still hang out.
And since we actually have two different offices, I'm in Philadelphia, Alex is in Ithaca, there's a lot of doodling that happens, and that's a big part of our process. And
I might call it a resource.
It is a resource. And the doodles actually you can start seeing the differences that we began to be interested within after our undergraduate education. So I went back to landscape school. Alex continued on to architecture school, but you can kind of notice that actually in the sketches themselves. So this is a little doodle we were doing for Andy Sprout's competition last summer. And what you'll notice is like I'm kind of more or less interested in this ecological, natural habitat, natural sort of systems approach to building. Well, Alex is.
It's like mostly nuts and bolts there, right? But miraculously, it sort of worked out. We actually placed in this competition. But anyway, so this is what the final result was. It's like in a nutshell, it was a deal where you know you had so little money that you had to be kind of, hate to use this word again, resourceful about, you know, building whatever these were, hats for visiting fellows. So we kind of figured out that maybe we should grow these walls rather than actually build them. So they're basically covered with all sorts of insulative vegetation.
So I guess the informal beginning of our firm happened back in about 2003-ish, 2004-ish, where we were working on a project in rural Pennsylvania, and the context is pretty much what you see here: a bunch of grain bin dryers that were pretty much spotted across the rural landscape of central PA.
Right. I'm supposed to say something. By the way, this is sort of another illustration. So Jason came prepared. I'm sort of winging things slightly, but that's kind of the nature of this relationship. Anyway, this was all really new to me. I've never seen that thing before. So that was my kind of reaction to all that.
And what you see on the left-hand side are these images of basically a bunch of bank barns, once again, more grain bin dryers. But what's being overtaken by this landscape is actually these mansions that are filling up much larger scape, right?
That would be these guys. Yeah.
On the right hand side, they're kind of trying to go after this English Tudor style or whatever else it may be
So
after.
that's past, that's present.
And also you see, once going back to these green bin dryers, which we're totally fascinated by, you see the patent for it on the right-hand side. But they have this very, very sort of poetic sense of space once you actually enter them and you see view them from the outside.
They do.
So the first, we're kind of out there in this context, in this world of the rural landscape. We were looking at building typologies as well as being inspiration for the actual building forms and design that we were undertaking. And the project was a golf course clubhouse that was kind of retaking over an agricultural landscape. So we were looking at typologies, technologies, how these buildings were being used, as well as so that the context and the material context within with which the materials that were applied to them, the habit, the occupants as well.
And also kind of nature of the poetic decay, which is great about these things, is once the stuff falls apart, it doesn't just kind of become rubbish in the landscape, it actually becomes kind of bird habitat. So that, you'll see later, might be somewhat important too.
And also just in general looking at, for example, the materials that are still used out there and have been used for many years, whether it's wood siding, hog siding on the left.
That's the vernacular term for corrugated fiberglass, by the way, hog siding.
And then, or the right is the CMUs or the standing seam roof and so forth. So looking at these, we basically begin to kind of reapply and rethink about how they actually were placed into a new structure, a new building. And essentially we used these technologies, pretty standardized, and kind of try to reinvent them a little bit. So rather than necessarily having a pitched roof, we actually had a monoslope, and then we covered it with hog siding, which results in...
And it glows at night.
Glows at night. And what happens is, it's a different kind of curb appeal, so to speak, which is also a very tough term for us to grasp.
Curb appeal. Well, actually, so the biggest question, that was, again, kind of a very new term to me. I don't know what that is still. It's as mysterious as this photograph, frankly. But the deal is, going back to this project sort of in a second, you realize that people were actually asking where the entrance was to that, right? Because it sort of wasn't clear. And apparently, well, to them anyway. And apparently we started sort of looking into this thing because, we had an entrance sign, it was actually pretty sort of well determined, it was pretty lit up. But we had basically 4 entrances of 4 different sides, which apparently is not cool with this kind of curb appeal thing. That basically deals with the idea that you apply certain surfaces to certain areas of the building and everything else kind of stays more or less covered by something like this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this product, but that's about 90% of the sort of vernacular American scape surfaces covered by vinyl siding, which is, to me, is sort of a love-hate relationship with this thing. It's actually kind of a scary thing, right? Because it's made out of God knows what, and it sort of never decays and just goes away into the landfill because it's so cheap. It's easier to just rip it down. But at the same time, it's actually quite an ingenious system, and it's sort of parametric and systemic, as you'll see later. And it's still me. And well, basically, so we kind of started working on this another project, which is basically kind of mixed income housing. This is actually kind of the inaugural project of INF. This is one of those things where we got a call from a developer, said, I have some money, I need design excellence on this thing. Why don't you guys form a practice? I said, all right, fine. So we did. And so this was the first project, and we realized it was basically kind of suburban housing. And we realized it's basically, for the most part, all about surfaces. Everything else, like this kind of massing, is more or less determined by sort of other things, like the way developers work, their sort of technique, the way that they procure materials, the way materials even come. So it's all sort of more or less predetermined. There's actually kind of a reason to all that madness, which we're sort of beginning to realize. Anyway, so we kind of were thrown in the middle of that, which is, again, to me anyway, was sort of an interesting experience after all these sort of highbrow educational sort of moments with one had in all these Ivy institutions and all that. So we ended up here, which is kind of interesting. And then so this was the first 5 buildings that we're building, another 30. Right. So this is actually kind of before all the veg happened. And again, this is totally within the kind of parameters of sort of developer situation. And we tweaked it as much as we could, and I think actually sort of fairly reasonable result, and again, given those parameters. But the kind of difference is sort of the curb appeal illustration. So this is before the veg, this is after the veg, and you see the for sale cells are already popping up. So this is kind of like packaged and ready to go. This is still in progress. And then kind of another side effect of curb appeal is that you basically end up, there's this front facade that everybody is after, right? And that's how, basically these things are sold, and that's how people look at these things. But then at the same time, there's the backyard. And the backyard usually contains these things. And these things actually also pretty fascinating. This is your sort of typical mid-statistic of American deck, the backyard deck, right? And we kind of started thinking about how to sort of appropriate that construction technique. And at some point, there was a project in Canada that was calling for design of the paradise, the garden that sort of evokes paradise. And we started thinking, and we realized that basically any garden, that's kind of like the history of, sort of biblical history pretty much of the world. Landscape design is inherent in its kind of search of paradise lost, right? So any kind of garden in one way or the other tries to find this paradise. And we also realized that, the closest you get to this kind of search of paradise is your backyard these days. So that's it. And that's actually, there isn't usually no vegetation there whatsoever because nobody wants to mow their lawn. Anyway, so we kind of, started figuring out what else you can do just using that typical construction, 2x6s, pressure treated, the kind of Simpkins ties, the usual stuff, straight, nothing fancy there. Just so it basically ended up with this kind of hyperbolic palabrode of a paradise. And so anyway, so that's the kind of the first deviation into the sort of the sideshow.
So as part of this this office of ours, making is a big point, is a huge part of it. So
I might call it a resource again. I'm afraid
because we are in two different places, we have to kind of reinvent ourselves and how we begin to make things. So a big part of it becomes a lot of field research and actually making in the field itself. So as a design build collaborative, one of our first projects we worked on was Governor's Island. This basically was reinventing after kind of leaving the golf course and doing the clubhouse. We said, well, there's a call for entries for the Governor's Island miniature golf course as part of Figment. We said, what can we do with golf, perhaps, and also, reuse some of the resources that we had initially. So this project was actually constructed of all the leftover materials from the initial clubhouse project. And as you can see, like we have slate, we have a little bit of asphalt shingles, we have the EPDM on the side, we have the a little bit of everything here, the gutters. And this actually, and it's actually, believe it or not, it's actually weatherproofed as well. So what we found was it was this collaboration and working in the field that actually drew a lot of our interests to be very quite similar despite our different backgrounds.
Right.
And that's kind of what kind of, I guess the energy behind our office and practice is about making these things in the field.
Well, but I must say the kicker was that, when you're dragging stuff from Ithaca and stuff's coming from Philadelphia and you meet it in New York, things really have to kind of fit. And they don't always. But that's another sort of something to figure out. I mean, you have to kind of be resourceful about making them fit.
This is actually a current project we're working on with Temple University. It's a design build project in Maryland, a small farm called Colchester Farm, which once again, looking at the posts and the materials, all these posts came from the ParkView project, the affordable housing project we had completed, or is in the process of being completed right now. So it's here again, it's the same sort of theme where we're being kind of quite resourceful, saving the resources that we do have to make this new form and also educate and learn with the students in the same process.
Right, and I guess another iteration of that is the same thing happened in Hong Kong, thanks to Eric and Marissa, who invited us to build a kind of a version of the grand resource there, but then of course we realized it's easier to build something there rather than import the stuff that we already had, so we kind of showed up there with a couple of drawings and we went to the local hardware stores and figured out how to do it and had kind of taught our local students how to sort of work this thing too, so it seemed like a kind of a reasonable thing to do at the time. At some point, we also realized that, once you started doing enough of these projects, we realized that we're kind of entering this potentially sort of theoretical territory, that because we're kind of working in this space which is sort of not really suburban, not rural, it's sort of somewhere in between. There's this strange thing happens in kind of mid-America these days where what was a farm once is now become a kind of suburban development, so it's not quite a rural thing, it's not quite a sort of residential thing, sort of somewhere in between. So it's, coined this term SURAL, which is kind of suburban residential roughly. I personally like it because it has this kind of surreal sort of sound to it, which to me it is. I mean, you walk in there, you go, whoo. So anyway, so under that rubric of SURAL, we kind of started working these sort of other side projects because we also happen to be somewhat impatient types, as you can tell, at least me. And certain projects, I mean, architecture is sort of one of these deals that takes a while, right? So, we started kind of inventing these other small things that we can kind of experiment with. So going back to vinyl siding, we realized that the thing, for all its kind of vilification that happens to it, it's also a pretty interesting sort of product because it's parametric and systemic, meaning that it has a certain kind of range that it can be applied for. So it's not necessarily only meant for straight things. So we realized that in combination with kind of modern tooling like CNC mills and stuff like that, and a little bit of creative lighting, you can actually kind of use the vinyl siding in a sort of reasonably creative way. So I mean, the option on the table was to kind of like look the other way and just let the developers put the stuff up, or do something with it. So we tried to do something with it. So we made a couple of these, we call them SURAL walls, as installations. And at some point we realized we probably have enough to do a house. So there's a model for a house next door that's kind of made in the same way.
And sort of following along the same trajectory, we took a little bit deeper look at the XPS, or like extruded polystyrene, that is used for foundation installation and housing, and realized how, obviously, during the process of making and manufacturing this material, there's a lot of off-gassing that occurs. Well, the interesting thing is we thought, well, how these things actually outlive landfills. What can we do to actually make them more productive for whether it's street furniture, whether it's backyard furniture? How do we actually kind of rethink these things and repurpose them a little bit? So this, what you see is the thought of a bench kind of forming, or being formed by these reclaimed pieces of XPS foam, and in combination with the bench, you can kind of make this landscape within it. And as a result, we have this thing called planch, part plant, part bench, and we call it planch.
Right, which were also built in Hong Kong, and I heard that they're still there, in more or less together. But the one in my office is still alive. So at some point, again, also we kind of had this, I don't know, we call it epiphany or something. But I mean, this is sort of Palladio is kind of a standard sort of second-year architecture history material. Everybody looks at. And we did too back in the day. And then at some point we realized that we actually had sort of a lot in common with Andrea. In a way that
Speak for yourself.
Right. No, not an appearance yet, but at some point. In a way that he too sort of dealt with these sort of agrarian clients who were these kind of gentleman farmers way back in Veneto, who had to kind of combine function and form somehow. And he kind of had to deal with these kind of developers or builders, I suppose. And he too had to figure out some kind of sort of a theory for it. And so here again is the Quattro Libri. And at some point we realized that, well, maybe it's time for us to produce our own Quattro Libri, except we called it the four books of architecture. And so it so happened that this was 500th year anniversary of Palladio just 2 years ago, and we started making this thing. So like, all right, we just got to do it. So, and we kind of summarized our sort of agrarian experience in this short treatise as well, and we even illustrated it in a similar way he would, using the woodcut block print, except ours were laser engraved. And then, he had the Cinque Ordini, right? And we discovered that, what Jason will tell you.
Well, basically, essentially, the suburban landscape is controlled by developers' orders. So with the developer comes also the banks and so forth. So we kind of allude to these different things that, in terms of lending and so forth. So there's a lot of other things that controlling these landscapes that we're looking at and these the sites we're looking at. So we decided to kind of, it was more or less a conclusive, not necessarily conclusive, but comprehensive look at the suburban environment and suburban landscape and how the order actually began to transpire.
Right. Well, I mean, basically, Palladio sort of coined, or not coined, he sort of applied his misunderstanding, I would say, of ancient Rome towards, the kind of local milieu, to use the sort of theoretical term. And we realized that it's already more or less present there. We just had to extricate it, and there's a drawing that sort of attempts to deal with that. And then, of course, the drawings were inked, and then there was an exhibition, and then there are the cans again, which I think will be important shortly. Pre-making. I mean, this is kind of getting crazy, huh? So this kind of came about. There was a show at the MoMA, you may recall, called the Home Delivery, right? About sort of prefab. And went there, and we kind of came away with sort of an easy feeling about it, I must say, because it seemed like it was sort of, I mean, even though it was a great show and it was a great book, but the overall sort of feeling about the kind of 100 years worth of effort to produce a successful prefabricated house was essentially failure. Because, for various reasons. I mean, one reason may be that because they couldn't sort of figure out, they couldn't design something viable, but for the most part, it's not so much the designer's fault, But it's the idea that you know, to produce a successful prefabricated house, you also have to have a manufacturing base to produce all the parts, right? So without sort of a massive retooling of manufacturing, you're basically doomed to failure. So that's where we started looking at Andy Warhol, no, at canned goods. And then we kind of came up with the idea of a house in a can, which you will sort of see shortly. But, well, here's kind of the short version of it. And actually, there's an article in Cornell Journal of Architecture coming out in the fall, kind of more or less about that. But the point, roughly being, is that, you know, these things, the grain bins already exist in the landscape out there. They're already accepted as such. And they're already kind of, there's a manufacturing base behind them to produce them quickly and cheaply and sort of fairly efficiently. So what you got to do is basically inject housing inside, and then you more or less have something that potentially has legs. And first we're kind of messing around it, literally making these things out of cans. But then it turned out that actually there was some interest in there. So we had a couple of calls from Canada and Texas who people want to build these things. So I think that's the next big project potentially. This is a cannery in Baltimore, by the way. And that starts suggesting things like that.
And then also, you know, these things can begin to come together as almost like more or less urban forms. So this is the 6-pack we call buy 5, get 1 free to the right. And the other thing we kind of came up with as well, thinking about how do you know, maybe there's a park in the can, so almost an instant park that you could actually, whether, you know, apply to brownfield sites or think about how do you kind of apply this instant landscape or instant kind of gardenscape to a place with access for the public.
I like this image.
So in part of this rescaling as well, I mean, a lot of our work has actually, up to this point, mostly been on the smaller sort of medium scale in terms of projects and design, but our interests also lie in sort of the infrastructural components and infrastructural systems as well. So this
enters the grand resource. It's the whole reason why we actually did this thing. But I mean, here there was this competition for basically kind of rethinking of the future of the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, but it wasn't so much that. I think it was an excuse for us to think about kind of a larger infrastructure within the city, right? Which is inevitably will again show up one way or the other. And here, we're appropriating that Schuhoff's Tower again, but it was more of an idea, right? And the idea was that, and of course, we also took this idea to Hong Kong again. Thank you for Eric and Marissa. Here it is in the landscape.
And also reapply it to different scale of itself. So here you see the plants, the orange and blue people are, you know, they're literally the scale figures kind of occupying this installation.
Right. And then finally, the kind of not so pleasant topic, but that's a resource too, money, right? So the question, I guess, is how do you sort of sustain a business? And sort of various ways. Basically say no to no project, pretty much, right? So whatever it is out there, we'll do, I think, within reason. We teach. We pay our interns still, but so there are certain things we don't go to. But anyway, at some point we realized that I think we also need to create a niche, and I think we found that niche.
So recently we did this installation along this banks of the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. And what essentially we realized that these ecological systems have other habitants, and urban systems also have other habitants called birds
or avians
that sometimes get overlooked. So this is a recent, like I said, in here, this is kind of a print we just had also done as well. But looking at it, each bird species has a different sort of specification, right? So they need different amounts of space, different amounts of ventilation, different access requirements, and so forth. And so we basically decided to build a little bit of, start building the development of a housing complex for birds.
Right, and also given that these are urban birds, the idea was that they start to kind of potentially reflect the habitation of the people themselves. So it was called, what was it called? Domus abicus philadelphicus. So here are a couple of them. So that's a row house, and that's was it Trinity?
That's a Trinity. That's a cardinal Trinity.
Right. So I suppose in conclusion, one must say that, you know, of course, this is kind of a quickie, so 24 minutes on the nose. And the point was not to show every single project, of course, because there are a ton. And the reason why there are a ton, because that's sort of, I gotta say it again, another resource, right? Because we do a lot of these sort of short projects competitions, and not so much because we're kind of really eager to, I don't know, so we just do a lot of work nonstop. but because it's also becomes kind of a laboratory of ideas, right? So whatever doesn't work out in a particular competition reappears somewhere else, and that's happened already several times. So for those of you who want to see more, it's there, and it's also in the next room. And
Thanks.